Good morning. Catching a sunrise here out at Washington Irving Recreation Area, but I call it Bears Glen because that's what most of the signs say till you get down here. And it's a beautiful place to catch the sun coming up in the morning. Okay, I'm going to continue with this beauty with Chapter 5, Liberation from Guilt. Our goal is to have a strong, positive self-concept and to be able to maintain it regardless of our expertise or lack of it in any particular area, and regardless of the approval or disapproval of any other person. I do have the boys with me today, so if you hear snoring or hustle and a bustle, Wiley and Zorro are with me today. So, all right, and moving toward this goal, the way you think about your behavior, the standards by which you judge it, and the context in which you see it is vitally important, especially at times when you are inclined to condemn yourself. Guilt obviously subverts positive self-esteem. Assessing your behavior entails certain questions, like, by whose standards do you judge your behavior, your own or someone else's? Do you seek to understand why you acted as you did? Do you consider circumstances, context, and options you perceived to be available at the time? Do you assess your behavior as you would if it were exhibited by someone else? When you think about your behavior, do you identify the specific areas or circumstances in which it occurs? Or do you overgeneralize and say, I'm ignorant, when in fact you may be ignorant of a particular subject and quite knowledgeable about many other subjects? Or say, I'm weak, when in fact you may lack courage or strength in a particular area and not in others. It looks like the sun's coming right there, my friends. Thank you for being with me. This is the book, How to Raise Your Self-Esteem by Nathaniel Brandon. Alright, there we go. It's not that the water's not beautiful, but the glow. Oh. Alright, here we go. We're going to continue. If you regret your actions, do you attempt to learn from them so that your future behavior does not repeat the same mistakes? Or do you merely suffer over the past and remain passively stuck in patterns of behavior you know to be inappropriate? The answer to all of these questions will have profound implications for your self-esteem. We feel guilt when 1. Contemplating something we have done or failed to do. We experience a diminished sense of self-worth. We feel guilt when we feel driven to rationalize or justify our behavior. We feel guilt when we feel defensive or combative when someone mentions the behavior. We feel guilt when we find it painfully difficult to remember or examine the behavior. Think of some action you have taken or failed to take for which you reproach yourself, something significant enough to have impacted your self-esteem. Then ask yourself, by whose standards am I judging? There's that sun. Okay. Think of, I'm going to reread that because I got distracted by the sun. It's the way it feels, y'all. It's beautiful. But it's the way it feels. Okay. Think of some action you have taken or failed to take for which you reproach yourself, something significant enough to have impacted your self-esteem. Then ask yourself, by whose standards am I judging? My own or someone else's? If the standards are not truly yours, then ask yourself, why do I really believe? Okay, what do I really believe about this issue? If you are a thinking human being and can honestly and with full consciousness see nothing wrong in your behavior, you may find the courage to stop condemning yourself right at this point. Or at a minimum, you may begin to gain a new perspective on the assessment of your behavior. I used to reproach myself, said Lucy at one of our last therapy sessions, because I have never wanted my mother to live with me. I mean, with me, my husband, and our children. I was raised with the teaching that duty to one's parents comes ahead of everything, and that selfishness is a sin. Oh, Lordy, Lordy. And that selfishness is a sin. But one of the things I got from therapy was to pay attention to what I really think, rather than what I sometimes tell myself I think. And the truth is that those teachings make no sense to me, especially in light of the fact that my mother always made it plain she didn't particularly like me. And I know I don't particularly like her. We never got along. Her lifelong theme was gloom and doom. She used to tell me something was wrong with me if I was too happy. I looked at the fact that if I allowed my mother to live with us, it would have been hell for me and for my family. So I said no. Now my sisters and brothers do not speak to me. I see life differently than the rest of my family. And it is my life, not theirs. So I'll go by what seems rational to me, and I will accept the consequences. I am not suggesting that all values are subjective, and that the moral is simply whatever an individual thinks or feels is moral. I develop my own concept of a rational and objective ethics, an ethics of rational or enlightened self-interest, in the book Honoring the Self. But people are often intimidated by the value preferences of others at the expense of their own needs, perceptions, and self-esteem. Further, I am not excuse me. Further, I am not addressing the problems sorry. Living in the grasslands. Okay. Further, I am not addressing the problems of psychopaths or people who appear to be lacking in normal guilt responses. If I were, I would have to touch on many issues I do not propose to cover here. In the practice of therapy, much of the so-called guilt we encounter has to do with the disapproval or condemnation of significant others, such as parents or spouses. It is not always advisable to take our own or anyone else's declarations of guilt at face value. Often when someone declares, "I feel guilty over such and such," what he or she really means, but rarely acknowledges. Friends joining us here. I am afraid that if mother or father or some other important person knew about what I had done, I would be criticized, repudiated, condemned. Often the person does not actually regard the action as wrong, in which case what he or she feels is not literally guilt. Okay, I'm going to start over this again. What he or she really means but rarely acknowledges is, I'm afraid that if mother or father or some other important person knew about what I had done, I would be criticized, repudiated, and condemned. Often the person does not actually regard the action as wrong, in which case what he or she feels is not literally guilt. So the solution to this category of guilt is to heed the authentic voice of the self, to respect your own judgment above the beliefs of others that you do not genuinely share, though you may pretend to. I recall therapy clients who professed to feel guilty over masturbation because when they were young, their parents taught them that it was sinful. Sometimes a therapist solves this problem by substituting his authority for that of the client's parents and assuring the client that masturbation is a perfectly acceptable activity. But this assumes that the guilt is caused by a mistaken idea about the morality of masturbation. I tend to regard this as the smoke screen problem. The deeper problem is dependency and fear of self-assertiveness. More specifically, fear of challenging the values of significant others. So I work first for a change of the definition of the problem as follows. I do not think masturbation is evil, but I am afraid of the disapproval of my parents. In thus reframing the problem, we have moved out of the arena of guilt and self-reproach. We have given the problem a more accurate and useful definition. And the challenge becomes, am I willing to stand by and act on my own perceptions and convictions? Such willingness is one of the meanings of honoring the self. As a person accepts this challenge, self-esteem rises. Sometimes protestations of guilt are a smokescreen for denied and disowned feelings of resentment. Excuse me. Thus, I have failed to live up to someone else's expectations or standards. I am afraid to admit that I am intimidated by those expectations and standards. I am afraid to acknowledge how angry I am over what is expected of me. So instead, I tell myself and others that I feel guilty over failing to do what is right, and I do not have to fear that I will communicate my resentment and place my relationship with others in jeopardy. If you recognize yourself in this description, the solution to your guilt is to be honest with yourself and others about your resentment. First, of course, you must be honest with yourself. Own your anger. Admit your resentment at standards and expectations not truly your own. And watch the guilt begin to disappear, although you may still have to work on your struggle for greater autonomy. If I weren't feeling guilty, said Irwin, in a sentence completion exercise aimed at exploring just this issue, I'd be feeling ... agitated. If I weren't feeling guilty, I'd demand to know by what right my family expects me to support my bum of a brother. If I weren't feeling guilty, I'd demand to know why I'm expected to carry the problems of other people. If I weren't feeling guilty, I'd tell them I'm sick and tired of being responsible for a person who won't be responsible for themselves. If I were not feeling guilty, I am not feeling guilty. I'm feeling rage. And then, if I were willing to be honest about my anger, I'd stop saying I feel guilty. If I were willing to be honest about my anger, I'd admit how different I am from the rest of my family. If I were willing to be honest about my anger, I'd feel cleaner and freer. Here's another sentence completion. If what I'm feeling is not really guilt, said Eunice, an unhappily married woman in therapy, I'll have to deal with my resentment of my husband's demands, that I live only for him. I'll have to face that resentment. If what I'm feeling is not really guilt, I'd admit that I love being back at work again. If what I'm feeling is not really guilt, I would scream about how tired I've been of sitting on my energy so my husband won't feel threatened. Here, again, the need for a change is seen in the definition of the problem. Undealt with resentment and fear of self-assertion are the issues that have to be resolved, not guilt. The alleged guilt is merely a means of protecting oneself from this deeper challenge. As you become more honest about your feelings, you give up the need to feel this kind of pseudo-guilt, and then you are freer to think clearly about values and expectations you may need to question and repudiate. This task is by no means always an easy one. If it were, people would not hide behind pseudo-guilt. But if you are willing to make the effort, if you generate the courage to sustain the quest for independence, and you can, the benefits to your self-confidence and self-respect will be virtually immediate. Okay, let's see. So we have some, my green dot has returned. It's all the way down. There we go. Let's see. Got a better place to stop at. This looks like it, actually, because the wind's picking up, and then there's a lot of questions here for you to answer, and the birds are coming in. Thank you for letting me read to you today and watching the sunrise with me. I appreciate you.